Hi everyone, this is the lecture we left off on the last time we met. I'm going to narrate the slides in this presentation to help you understand the tables and charts you're looking at, as well as unpack the reading by Fisher and Hout with styles. I hope these recorded audio bites will help you to understand everything and know what you need to focus on for the exam. As we were talking about last time, this reading deals with incomes from the 1970s to the year 2000. This is very dated, so please bear in mind that I've recorded some updated figures. In 2000, classes were highly divided in income, the most divided of any Western nation. The highest quintile earned twice the middle quintile, which earned twice the bottom quintile. The next two slides are going to show the population divided into quintiles. Quintiles is just a way of dividing a population into fifths. So in this case, the curve we're looking at represents the United States population's earnings. The green area under the curve is the bottom quintile. On the left-hand side, in the left-hand tail of that distribution, are the 20% of Americans, the 1/5 of Americans who earn the least money. The pink area under the curve represents the next quintile, those 20% of Americans who earn next to the least amount of money. This is generally called the fourth quintile. The third quintile, or middle quintile, is represented here in purple. This represents those Americans who earn in the middle of the income distribution. The blue area is the second quintile, which represents the next to the top fifth of American earners. And then the gray area under the curve represents the fifth of Americans who earn the very most. Somewhere way out in the right-hand tail of that distribution, under the gray area of the curve, you can think about the top 1% of earners and even the top 0.1% of earners existing. This pie chart shows the wealth distribution of the United States in the year 2000. Data come from the Brookings Institution. You can see that the dark purple area represents the top quintile, the top 20% of earners in the United States in the year 2000. And if you mouse over that purple area in the slideshow mode, you'll see that that represents 83% of all wealth in the United States. Now if you look at the next area, that kind of plum purple area, you'll see that that represents 10% of the total wealth in the United States. That's the second 20%, so the second highest earning group. So if you're paying attention, that represents 93% of all the wealth that there is, with about 7% remaining, which is convenient because each of those tiny little slices represent the middle, the fourth, and the bottom quintiles. So that represents 60% of Americans and 6% of the total wealth. Because each of those slices, if you mouse over them, own 2% of the total wealth. So one way to say this is, to summarize this is, that the top 40% of Americans own 93% of the wealth, and the bottom 60% own 6% of the wealth. Here's an update of that same distribution from 2016, with data again coming from the Brookings Institution. Here, it's done a little differently, because you'll see that the first area in the chart represented in blue actually represents just the top 1% of wealth in the U.S. So the top 1% of households earn or own 29% of all U.S. wealth, with the next 19% represented in red. So you can think about that red and blue area together representing the top quintile. And together, they own 77% of the wealth, which is still quite a lot, but slightly down from the 83% we saw in 2000. Now this chart has just combined the middle 60%. So that's going to be the third, fourth, and second quintiles. They're collapsed into that green area, and you can see that together they own 21% of the wealth. The bottom quintile is represented in purple, and you can see that they own 2% of U.S. wealth. So since 2000, we've changed a little bit because in 2000, the lowest three quintiles each owned about 2%. Here they own slightly more than that. But that bottom quintile hasn't changed at all. It's still right at 2%. So Fisher and Hout with Stiles next discuss trends in inequality over time, focusing on the years 1949 through 1999. So looking at the post-World War II boom years and the kind of idyllic 1950s, moving on to 1999-2000. Remember that this article was originally published in 2006, and 2000 was really the last year for which they had reliable census data and income figures. I've updated this information a little bit. So the next chart we look at is actually going to look at 1979 through 2009. And the chart after that is going to look at 1979 through 2015. This graph tells the story of how after-tax incomes have changed for U.S. Americans from 1979 to 2010. So first I want to orient you to the chart. We're looking at income in hundreds of thousands of dollars, with the y-axis starting here at $0 and going up to $2,500,000. If you look at the legend showing what each of the lines represent, you'll notice that, again, this chart has broken out the top 1%, but also the top 5%. So that kind of rosy pink color represents the top 1% of all earners. And the kind of grayish blue line represents the top 5% of all earners. The next line is the orange line, and it represents the overall change in average after-tax income for all U.S. Americans. So you can think of this line as representing kind of everybody all together. So how the economy has changed overall. The green line represents the top 20% of all earners altogether. The purple line represents the fourth 20%, meaning not the highest 20%, but the next 20%. The kind of lighter green line represents the third 20%, or the middle 20%. And then the red and blue lines at the bottom that you can kind of barely see represent the bottom 40%. So the red line represents the next to bottom 20%, and the blue line represents the very bottom 20%. You have to look closely for those lines because they're squished right there at 0 for the entirety of the chart. So let's start by looking at the top 20%, or the top 1%, and noticing that the average after-tax income for the top 1% of earners from 1979, where it was about $750,000 a year, has gone up. It peaked in about 2005, 2007, at around $2 million a year. And it dropped during the economic recession, 2007, 2008. It dropped to just $1,500,000, but now it's rebounding. If you then look at the next line, the top 5% of earners, you see a similar pattern, but with a lot less kind of peaks and valleys. You can see it rise kind of steadily, but not very much, from around $500,000 in 1979 to around $700,000 in 2009. So it's risen steadily with fewer peaks and valleys, but not nearly as much. The orange shows the overall trend for all US Americans, and you can see that it's grown a little bit. It's grown from about, say $300,000 in 1979 to right around $500,000 in 2009, with dips for recessions. Here we see that the third 20%, the top 20%, represented by that kind of teal green line there, right under the orange one. We see that the top 20% has pretty much kept up with the overall growth in the economy. In fact, it's almost mapped directly onto the overall growth of the economy. That's because the top 20% is largely driving this economic growth altogether. If you look at the bottom three lines, the bottom 4 lines, the bottom 80% of the population, you see that they've grown basically none at all since 1979. Now, this is inflation adjusted, meaning in terms of numbers, the income has grown, but in terms of real buying power, the real value of a dollar, these bottom 4 quintiles have really not changed significantly since 1979. We've had basically flat after-tax incomes for 80% of Americans. So this graph actually shows something a little different. It shows how much average inflation-adjusted household incomes have grown since 1979. And we can see that, again, the top 1% is broken out, but the quintiles are not broken out in as much detail. So this is just kind of showing bigger trends. Notice also that this is before taxes and transfers. So before we were looking at after-tax income, we're now looking at before-tax income. Next, we'll look at after-tax income again. So to orient you to this chart, the x-axis goes all the way to 2015 with real data, and has projections for how things will change by 2021. So that's what you see way off to the right, represented by those empty circles. And on the y-axis, you can see negative growth or shrinkage all the way down to 50%. So this would mean that an income level dropped by 50%, all the way up to 350% growth at the top of the y-axis. And the gray bars in the middle throughout the chart represent recession. So if you look beginning in 1979, you see that all incomes were pretty much squished together. And then from there, inequality really took off. We see that top incomes, the top 1% of incomes, has grown by 218%, with some peaks and valleys, really peaking just before the 2007-2008 recession at 300% growth, taking a dive to just 100% growth, or 150% growth, but then rebounding to 218% growth compared with 1979. Then if you look at the rest of the top 20%, represented here by the next line from the top, that represents the 81st to 99th percentile. So basically, the top 20% minus the top 1%. You can see that they've experienced 75% growth in inflation-adjusted dollars compared with 1979. Whereas the lowest 4 quintiles, so the middle 3 quintiles and the lowest quintile, have each experienced 33% growth. At times, they've experienced actual shrinkage compared with 1979, so at times they've been worse off. Notice what happened to both the lowest quintile and the middle 3 quintiles during and after the 2008-2009 recession. They didn't take the nosedive that the top 1% did, but they didn't have as far to go. But notice that where the top 1% has really rebounded, that lower 80% really hasn't. Notice that also that by 2021, it's projected that the top 1% will reach 256% growth compared with 1979, getting them right back up to where they were before the last recession, where the top 20% is expected to achieve 90% growth, but the bottom 80% is really only expected to reach 41 and 42% growth respectively. So this chart shows something completely different. This chart shows the Gini ratio for the United States and how it's changed over time from 1947 to 2012. So the Gini ratio is a metric measuring income or wealth inequality within a distribution of income or wealth, generally a population. It was invented by an Italian economist whose last name was Gini, and it was invented in 1912. To orient you to this ratio, a little bit, since it's a ratio, it ranges from 0 to 1, and a 0 on the Gini ratio represents perfect equality. If your population or your society gets a 0, it means that literally everyone in the society has exactly the same thing. Now, that's never been observed. The lowest observed Gini ratio belongs to Norway, and it's at 2.5. Belgium is just a squidgen higher. The highest Gini ratio observed for any population is Mexico or Brazil, depending on the year you look. And it's at about 6 or 6.5, depending on the year you look. So in 2012, the lowest Gini ratio of any nation was 2.5, and the highest would have been 6. So the United States is in the top half of Gini ratios for the world. But what this chart shows, the 3 lines on this chart don't represent different countries. They represent different ways of looking at inequality within the United States. So the green line at the top represents all U.S. persons, but I want us to focus on the blue and the red line at the bottom that map really neatly onto each other. Notice that they seem to follow exactly the same pattern, even though the red line is just a little lower. The red line represents all U.S. families, and the blue line represents all U.S. households, which includes people who live together but aren't families. So that could include, for example, people who share housing with roommates, or people who share housing with foster families. So if you look, in 1947, the U.S. family Gini ratio was around 3.7. If you look at where it is today, it's right at 4.5. The household index, or household ratio, which represents people who live together who may not be family, has always been a little bit above 4, and now is at about 4.7. So if the highest observed in the world is 6.0, we're at 4.7. That's pretty unequal. Canada is right around 3. As I said, Belgium and Norway are right around 2.5. We're tied with China and doing just a little better than Mexico.